Local historian is probably a very strong word. I love history. I do love history, and I do study it a lot. And bizarrely, when I was based in Virginia Beach before coming up to Dayton, I do a lot of work on the Revolutionary War, which was always a lot of fun. We would go and study, and I've still never heard of a place called Yorktown. While we were doing that, my wife would always be worried that I might get just a little bit kind of full of myself and might not return home if I had given a lot of. It was with the American Training and Doctrine Center, so there was lots of usually gung-ho artillerymen listening to the British view of Yorktown, which I would normally start with, "We lost." So why am I interested in this since coming to Dayton? Well, one is the interest of history. Two, I grew up in the other Kettering, or very near to the other Kettering, some 3,000 miles away. The World War II is all around there. Any of you who've watched Masters of the airfield was very close to there. My mother grew up near one called Grafton Underwood, which I think was the largest US base in Europe during World War II. Bletchley Park was down the road. And Bletchley Park, even as I grew up, nobody knew anything about. And it was in the late 1990s, early 2000s, that this very sad-looking place that you see there, refurbished, but this very sad-looking place that had basically been shut for 50 years was, if you like, discovered, reopened. People started to ask what went on there. Now, if you go to Bletchley Park, you cannot escape the name Turing, termed there the father of AI. There's the Turing Academy, and there's all sorts of things associated with the work of Alan Turing. Now, it's not to say the UK always treated him well. They didn't, especially for what he did. They could have done a lot better by him. But now Alan Turing's name is very well known. So imagine my surprise when I come to Dayton and I didn't realize there was anything here other than I knew about the Wright brothers and I knew about the work on the Manhattan Project, but I had no idea that anything else really happened here. The more I read, the more I find that is far from the case. And I kind of got a little bit obsessive about trying to promote the work of Joseph Desch. And I'll go into why as I go through this talk. I really want to look at why it matters. And you'll see as we get towards the end, some of the impacts of that work, the real tangible impacts, and also the kind of people who recognize him. But I'm going to start with a little bit of background. So when I first did a talk on Desch and the Codebreakers, I'd seen a couple of things. One, it was to the Far Hill Speaker Series back in about 2017. And I was thinking, this is fantastic. I'm enjoying myself researching this. And I came across an article in the Cincinnati Enquirer that said those darn Brits have made a movie about all the code breaking and they've not mentioned the Americans once. So that was a little intimidating, thinking, okay, there's a line I've got to walk in this talk. But I thought, well, I can navigate that. And I'll try, and be diplomatic about it. And then just as I was about to talk and I was already up the front and, you're a little bit kind of nervous, somebody says, oh, you should know Joseph Desch's daughter is in the front row. So no pressure there. So it's important to give credit where credit is due. And one thing that the British have to a point been less inclined to give credit to is actually the Poles. And that's changing because there were some Polish mathematicians who had done the initial work to break the German codes. Then Poland was overrun. They handed the work to the British and the French. France was overrun, and all the remaining work was handed over to the UK and to Bletchley Park. And thank goodness it was. This is an Enigma machine. The Enigma machine was essentially the German device to encrypt messages and send them to all of their forces. And by all of their forces, that comes down as well to things like the weather service, the diplomatic service. So there were all sorts of people trained to use this Enigma and send codes that they believed were unbreakable. So Britain had to get to work on cracking the three-wheel Enigma code. And so that's where we'll start some of this. So in 1940, what was happening? Well, it's important to recognize the war, to put it mildly, was going badly. Britain counted amongst its successes evacuating 335,000 troops from Dunkirk. That was a success. But as I learned recently reading a great book, which I will give it a little plug if you haven't read it, is Freedom's Forge. I'd never realized until reading that book, Britain was down, according to Churchill, to 17, that is 17 tanks. Everything else was left in France. And so you try rebuilding an army to do that without some monumental industrial effort and monumental industrial support. And so guess where that came from? It came from the United States. And again, the more I read, the more I learn on this. To rebuild that, Britain needed to put an order in for 1,000 tanks a month, 1,000 aircraft a month, 9,000 aero engines. It was busy building fighters in the UK, the Spitfire. The engines for the Spitfire were being built by Packard. It was needing to build bombers. They were largely built over here at first, the Liberty ships and so on. And so what that all meant was that Britain was out of raw materials, or it was exhausting itself of raw materials, food, fuel, but it needed the weapons of war that were all left on the beaches of Dunkirk. And the transatlantic pipeline was fundamental to saving the British war effort, and indeed the Allied war effort that as people from Norway and Belgium and the Netherlands had all come across to the UK if they had managed to survive the onslaught. As the U-boats appeared all across the Atlantic convoy routes and their successes grew, the need for that Enigma to be broken grew rapidly. But not just broken, but at the speed and scale that was necessary for commanders to make decisions. And in that way as well, and this was fundamental, not betray to the Germans that the codes had been broken. It was always one of those things. They always said there's got to be 2 or 3 different information points that the Allies can refer to as to why they knew something was happening. Otherwise, if it was just, it would just appear that there was a submarine raised and an Allied bomber came over. It wouldn't take long for somebody to realize that the codes had been broken. So it took some very difficult decisions by the Allies. And those included, from what I read, and it's different historians say different things, but the commonly stated one is that Winston Churchill knew that Coventry was going to be bombed, and he had to let it happen because there was no other corroborating evidence at that point. Later on in the war, Britain absolutely knew that the German forces were going to invade Crete, how they were going to do it, when they were going to do it. But with no corroborating evidence, Churchill could not advise the forces in Crete what was coming their way. So it was important. But the transatlantic pipeline, then, as you see here, the losses in shipping, in people over that period, I just want to pull out some figures that are particularly relevant to this. To put some feel for it, imagine just for a moment if a submarine was to sink 2 6,000-ton ships and a 3,000-ton ship. Typically, that would equate to 42 tanks, 8 howitzers, 88 other types of guns, 24 armored cars, 3,000 tons of stores. Put another way, 1 month would have equaled 1,600 tanks, 300 howitzers, 800 armored cars. And imagine the impact of that on D-Day. And bearing in mind, Dad said how Britain was able to push for 1,000 tanks a month to be manufactured over here. You can see that the American actual manufacturing base had to accelerate even more because when those calculations were made about what Britain needed, that didn't factor in that it would be losing more than that a month, sinking to the bottom of the Atlantic. So where I then put this in impact is that every month D-Day was being put back another month. Basically, the D-Day landing's worth of equipment was being lost every month under the Atlantic Ocean. The point, and I will come back to this later, every month D-Day delayed, World War II delayed, a lot of us may well not exist, depending on your background and where your relatives were in Europe or on transatlantic convoys or in the Navy or other branches of the military. World War II prolonging by a month, 2 months, 3 months, all of the tragedies of the Holocaust would have continued and all of the other destruction that was going on. Before America joined the war, America was already, as I mentioned, its industrial base was already pushing so much material to the UK. The Atlantic War was a shared war, even though it was largely policed by the Royal Navy at that time, not to mention the Canadians as well. Essentially, a lot was going on beneath the public persona of the United States neutrality. In February 1941, 4 Americans visited Bletchley Park. One thing that I find, quite difficult to take really is that they complained about the British food. I know, amazing, isn't it? They somehow didn't like beans on toast amongst other things. But they had to break that some quite tough barriers with the British, who knew obviously that they'd broken the German 3-wheeled Enigma machine. They knew they'd got access into a lot of, therefore, of the German codes that were going on, and they didn't know how much to tell a neutral country, even if it was America, even if it was America that was piling all of this aid to keeping Britain afloat. So it led to trust. It led to an essential trust. And they say, for those of you familiar, the Five Eyes relationship, where UK, US, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, to this day share the deepest level of intelligence between nations that exists anywhere or has ever existed anywhere. They say it started essentially at Bletchley Park over a glass of sherry between these 4 Americans and their UK counterparts. But a second piece to that I'll come on to was between Joseph Desch and Alan Turing, and the trust that they built in working to break these codes. Again, second to none, and it led to the intertwining of the intelligence sharing between the US and the UK that to this day has not pulled apart. So I touched on Joseph Desch earlier. He was part of NCR's Electronic Research Laboratory. But who was he? He was known as a brilliant and innovative mathematician, educated at UD and living in his dream home in Greenmont Avenue in Oakwood. However, while he may have been local, needing a high security clearance was not that straightforward, as he had German relatives, including his half-cousin in Dayton, whose father was not only living in Germany, but was a member of the Nazi Party. Consequently, as Desch embarked on his work to help defeat the German Enigma codes, he avoided his cousin for the duration of the war. His achievements in setting him apart to be selected for a leading role in the code-breaking efforts included that he had beaten MIT to the development of an electronic computation device, the size of a dishwasher. He had also expanded the use of microfilm, magnetic digital recording, and relatively high-speed printers for that period. And in doing so, he gained a reputation as a real innovator, leading NCR into the electronic age. At the same time, the US Navy deciphers at an organization known as OP-20G were struggling to get into the electronic age. So they lent on NCR and its talents amassed in Montgomery County to defeat the Nazi codes. And of course, it was to be a team effort with the British, whose delegation was led by Alan Turing, the designer of the British bomb machines. And more on him in a moment. And so why was this collaboration necessary? Well, ultimately, we talked about the British essential links across to the US to rebuild its war effort. But the German Navy had suspected, from what I've read, never had proof, but suspected the Allies had broken the Navy codes. And so that Enigma machine that you saw earlier, they added a fourth rotor to that machine. And so almost overnight, Britain went from being able to crack lots of codes that Alan Turing and his team had done to not being able to do so. And then only managed to do it very, very slowly and laboriously. And they needed something else. And what they needed was essentially the engineering might of the US and to see the work of Joseph Desch. And so it was that overcame Alan Turing. Those of you who've seen me before will know that I often then say otherwise known as Benedict Cumberbatch. Those of you who've seen The Imitation Game, though, the point that I make in this is that there has been a Hollywood movie made about all the things that Alan Turing did. And quite right too, and very well justified too, even if it not necessarily accurate in some places, in my view. I do feel quite strongly is that compare that to the work of Joseph Desch and compare that to the publicity around Joseph Desch, and it's so much less. And it's one of the reasons that I like to give these talks, because I firmly believe that there's a bit more equity required in this, especially when I go on to say the US bomb machine designed down the road here in Dayton, designed by an Oakwood resident, was 35 times faster than the original British bomb. And so it brings it home to you. And why was that necessary in itself? Well, the number of combinations on the four-wheeled Enigma that the Germans had developed is 10 to the 18. And those of you who've seen the PBS documentary will see a scientist really well explain what that actually means. And he starts with, that is more atoms than there are in this room. You think, okay, I can get that. But he goes on, more atoms than in the whole of the United States, the whole of this planet to the whole of the known universe. And the difficulty the Allies had was that every day, that 10 to the 18 amount of possible combinations would be started again. A different set of codes would be put in by the Germans, or a different setting. And so whatever code breaking you'd done up until midnight the previous day was lost, and you had to start again. What the Joseph Desch machine did was turn 1, speed, which was essential, 2, accuracy, and 3, reliability. And the other thing then, that in terms of industrial weight over here, the US could turn out, in the end, it was around 120 bomb machines. So the whole Allied code-breaking effort just went up very, very significantly. And the way that we tend to describe is that whilst Alan Turing, to use a football analogy, got 2/3 of the way down the pitch, even 3/4 of the way down the pitch. But to get it over the goal line, it took Joseph Desch, and it took the work of the waves, and it took the work of all that went on down at the NCR to do so. It's important in our eyes to see that is recognized. Where we get to, and so I return to this slide, it shows up so much better on here. In 1941, you can see that Allied ships lost was 496. 1942, was 1,006. 43, 284. 44, 31. That's where you would see graphically the impact of the code-breaking efforts. But alongside that, and again, something that is really important on this is the number of U-boats being sunk. And that is the figure to the left. And so you see in 1941, 35 U-boats were sunk. 42, that went up to 87. But remembering then the German ability to build U-boats was so prolific at that time that 35 and 87 did not make much impact, as you can see from the losses. 43, 237. There, the code-breaking efforts, the work that was going on in Bletchley Park, the work that was especially now going on here and over in Nebraska Avenue in DC, to break and translate the codes and then push them back to Allied commanders, were having a massive impact on the war and the ability to slow down the attrition in the Atlantic, but more importantly still, to allow the Allied war effort to build up in Europe for the next stages that were to come. Now, there's also, at this point though, there were other developments, and that's where the big map to the right does explain there was more to it. And some people have tried to say, well, the codebreakers, their role was, it can be explained away because actually it was advances in aircraft technology, it was advances in ships. And some of that is absolutely true. So the ranges of aircraft on the right-hand side, suffice to say, when the Battle of the Atlantic started, aircraft had a very limited range. They could only go to a certain point in the Atlantic, whether flying out of the UK or the US or Canada, in the hope of protecting convoys. There was a middle period which lasted about 3 days where the U-boats considered it the happy season. No aircraft would find them. There was no danger of being found by aircraft, and they could almost fight with impunity and just pick off merchant shipping wherever, whenever they pleased. During the course of the war, the Allies developed the ability to have long-range patrol aircraft that could operate from Iceland, but also could cover the entire expanse of the ocean. And that is all true. They developed better sonar for their ships, all true. Their ships, their warships, and their patrol aircraft still needed to know the kind of areas to patrol, the kind of areas where the submarines were operating. Otherwise, 9 million square miles of ocean, you're still not going to find a little submarine conning tower sticking up to get air. So the code breakers pointing to where the patrol should take place were as essential as ever. I'd like to cover D-Day. So D-Day, it was a question that was put to me. Why are you talking about D-Day as a land-based operation when the Enigma codes that we're talking about were there for essentially for the Battle of the Atlantic, to beat the U-boats? And the reason is the Battle of the Atlantic was, if you like, it was a stage that had to be gone through, however painful and horrific it was. It was simply a stage to be gone through to prepare for the ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany. And the ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany was always going to come from an Allied landing in Europe. And so D-Day, as you heard me talking about those figures earlier, was being put back and put back and put back as the materials, the war materials, the munitions simply weren't in place until a point where they were. And the Battle of the Atlantic to that point had served its purpose. It had got the Allies to a position of strength, and the Allies were ready to liberate mainland Europe. So they went ahead and did that with all of those materials. And then I pull up these. What is important about these? These are real D ciphers. from Allied codebreakers. What they bring out is just how effective the code-breaking effort was of the Allies. But it's now where the story really does flip very much from what the work of Bletchley Park was into the real-time effect of the work of Joseph Desch and of the codebreakers of Dayton and the Waves. Still not forgetting the efforts of their British counterparts. It was a team effort, but the speed of the US bomb meant those codes were being broken in real time. And these are real ones that I'll now just sort of unpick a little. So one, it was a broken German code, described how the Germans were beginning to think something was not right around June the 5th, and to bring their forces to readiness. There seemed to be detections of Allied activity. So detected real time, this would almost certainly have landed up on Eisenhower's desk at the D-Day planning room. But then there is the one, the reporting situation to do with Allied paratroops. Realizing when they had, the Germans had diverted troops to Allied airborne landings, they actually weren't Allied airborne landings. The Allies were carrying out deception and dropping dummies all over to divert German forces away from the beachheads. And what these codes said, basically, again, told the Allies is, we have diverted these units away from the beachhead. To the point where the Allies knew the location and orders of every German formation on D-Day. So again, and it hugely impressive and impactful effect. Then there was within this, the greater sense that of the codes being broken was that they realized that the Germans, specifically Hitler, was falling for the idea that the main Allied landings were not on the 6th of June. They were going to be undertaken by General Patton and the 1st US Army Group that was based in Kent in southern England and was going to come across the shortest route from UK to France across to Calais, about a 17-mile trip, if you will. And so Hitler was holding back divisions that could have done a lot of harm to the Allied landings. And so what the code breakers were finding out was, keep reinforcing the lie that Patton's army group exists, because it didn't. It was all on paper, and it was again made up of inflatable tanks and inflatable artillery and so on. And the Allies had spent months creating this myth around Patton's army group. What these messages said on D-Day is, Hitler's fallen for it, and the longer we can keep him being deceived, the greater our chances of success. And then one of those I really do like in these broken codes, there's an artillery battery commander. He was basically firing on Omaha Beach. He reports his battle damage report after the Allied aircraft had been in and bombed that area. And he's telling his command, don't worry, all is well, I can carry on firing. And I heard somebody kind of realize what comes next, because the Allies immediately, and again, this real time enabled by these machines, they were able to say to one of the air forces, Royal Air Force, US Air Force, apparently we missed that target, go back. And so the Germans were providing us in real time, oh, you missed, come back. And so the whole effect of this was, again, to make D-Day a success. It was one of the contributing factors. Clearly, there's a lot more, not least the poor guys who are having to run up the beaches and fight head on. But this was making that job easier. It was knocking out more artillery than would otherwise be firing on them. And in having one of these conversations one day in Oakwood, there was a lady who turned to us and said, my father was on Omaha. He was a medic. And you just think just that alone, and you could see that realization, oh my goodness, he might not be here if it wasn't for the code breakers. It's one of those things where people say sometimes, well, It almost sounds Monty Python-esque. What did the codebreakers ever do for us here in the Midwest? And I go back to that earlier comment. They brought the war to an early end, earlier than it would otherwise have been. They therefore saved what are probably millions of lives. And I'll come on to that now with the next slide. So it's a point I always say, and I bring out, I don't like what ifs. I generally, if I see a what if historian, I'll switch the TV over. But it's important with the codebreakers to really understand the impact of their work. You've seen the impact on the convoys, the reduction in the submarine threat, the vast increase in the destruction of U-boats, and therefore the safer transit of more and more people. You've seen that, and you've seen the effect on D-Day, the real-time effects to help D-Day be successful. But if they had not been successful, there's always a common thing that we hear, being Brits, if it wasn't for the US, you'd be speaking German. I would say straight up, if it wasn't for the US, we would have lost. But the world would look different to the way that a German-dominated world would have been. And from what I've read from different historians, and I've been very careful to do it from historians, not from my opinions on this, the Soviet Union, having been poked, much in the way that the US was, mobilized an enormous industry. And Germany's forces from Stalingrad onwards were going to lose. It was only a case of when and how many millions died in the process. But the Soviet Union could just throw manpower at it in a way that Germany no longer could. So the historian's projection of this is simply the Soviet Union would have carried on. And the only reason it didn't before was because of the Allies and D-Day racing to get to places like Austria and Berlin and the Netherlands and Belgium and so on. Had it not, there was nothing stopping Stalin just continuing to go. And again, from what people see of Stalin's intentions, that was the intention. So the most likely scenario that I could see is, had the codebreakers not been able to make D-Day effective, is that the Soviet Union would have been the closest trading partner of a very quiet United Kingdom. So that is one piece. They also say with that, had the war in the Atlantic and the codebreakers not been successful, had the attrition become too much to sustain to the American public opinion, Roosevelt would quite rightly have been pointed to, well, hang on, the European war wasn't really our thing. We started the war because of Pearl Harbor. So why not turn towards the Pacific? If that had happened, Churchill almost certainly would have been brought down. Britain would have again have made peace. And again, the most likely result, Soviet Union would have come right up. So it is really, to me, it is really important when people say, so what did the codebreakers do for us? Why should it matter? It should matter because the world would have been horrific without them. And the last one needs no explanation. That is Auschwitz. So again, every month, every day that was allowed to carry on doing its work was a tragic day for humanity. And one, again, we should always be grateful to the codebreakers for helping bring that to an early end and enabling the troops in their tanks or in their aircraft to act decisively to win earlier. Alan Turing, treated horrendously in the UK after the war because of his sexuality, and unfortunately took his own life in the early 50s, I think it was. He did it by biting into a poison apple. Word has it, and I've seen it said in more than one place, the sign on your iPhone comes from that. It's a bitten into apple, and it's a bit of a tribute. Don't quote me on that, but I've seen that in 2 or 3 places where people have said that is how the symbol came to be. But he's also commemorated on the £50 note. There is also the Turing Academy. Recently, I was at a US Navy conference in DC where they talked about Project Turing in honor of Alan Turing and all of his work, and it's a monumental effort inside the Navy, and it's not classified before anybody kind of gives me a hard time. But I asked flippantly to the people I was sitting next to, I wonder when there'll be a Project Desch. And people just looked at me like I'd come from outer space. Who's Desch? Everyone knows Turing. So, Joseph Desch. So he got the National Order of Merit. He's in the NSA Hall of Fame. General Eisenhower and Roosevelt and Churchill, they all honored him. And here's some of the quotes from that. So Churchill described the code-breaking efforts as the goose that laid the golden egg and never cackled. And of course, Churchill had his way with words in lots of things. But you also think on this about people like the Waves here. Many, many people in the UK as well who had to lie about what they did until they went to their graves. You know, and I've heard stories here where people said, oh yeah, I was a secretary. And they weren't. They were code breakers. They were helping make the code breaking effort happen that was so secret for such a long time until really the late 90s. And my gut feeling is there's still more to come. So that was one piece. And then you see, I do like to say this because in the UK, you can see the quote there from Google. Alan Turing is a hero to many people at Google. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that without Alan Turing, Google, in the form we know, no, it would not exist. And again, I say this for a really key reason. Picked up a little hint of it by now, that I do feel that having grown up in the UK where World War II was everywhere, the more I realize the debt that is owed to people like Joseph Desch, the more I feel more should be known about him and what that role was. And the role of the Waves, the people who had to keep that quiet. And even the other day, my dear wife, Cheryl, was doing some painting instruction with a lady who said, oh, my dad, he used to do some work at NCR and make things there, but he couldn't ever talk about it. And it just gets you thinking, I bet I do know what he was doing. So it's to us, to both of us, we feel very passionate about this. So it sort of makes me walk into my last formal slide. And as I say, then I could chat for hours on this, but I'm certainly happy to take questions. So for those interested on Chris Froelich, who is in this audience, and he wouldn't want me to mention him, but he's forged a nice link with the NSA, the National Cryptologic Museum. And they've started doing a speaker series into Wright Memorial Library. The next one, the Battle of the Codes, will be at Wright Memorial Library on the 23rd of January, so this Thursday. More to come in the spring. The Wright Memorial Library is also, for those interested, building an exhibit case, basically, with a bomb rotor, a crib sheet. So the bomb rotor designed and built here in Dayton, a crib sheet that used by the codebreakers, the actual Enigma machine. And the unique thing about this Enigma machine is it was built by the US. And it was built, so having intercepted German Enigma codes, gone through the bomb machine to decrypt, they then needed to validate that those codes had indeed been legitimately broken, and they made sense when you then pumped them back into an Enigma machine and they came out reading legitimate battle orders, if you like. So the US had some Enigma machines, not many, but enough just to prove that the codes were being broken. So there is that exhibit is being put into Wright Memorial Library from the 23rd. We then have Sir Dermot Turing, Alan Turing's nephew. He's an author, historian, and he's very embedded into the cryptologic psyche, if you like, of both the US and the UK. He's at the International Cryptological Conference in DC in May, and then he's coming here. And so do look out if you're interested for Carolyn Park. He's likely to do a speaker event there. and we expect him to do a speaker event at the Peace Museum. And they will be different. They'll be on the same day, but they will be different. One will be aimed at how the Codebreakers brought about peace and was supportive of peace. And the other is more looking historically at the role of the Desch-Turing interactions and how their work impacted the world. So that's what we're looking at. And one that is dear to us is to get a state marker at some point in recognition of the work of the Codebreakers, broader than simply Joseph Desch, but to bring in the waves and the role in this area. And again, the more we learn, not just this area, but we understand there to be over 20,000 individual companies that contributed to the development of or to the building of the bomb machines. So that's where we are, and I hope you've got something from this afternoon or this evening. Happy for questions.
Wow, thank you, Andrew, thank you.